Conesti, how are ye? Welcome to the Candlelittales podcast, and this time we are doing the post-show chat of Conchubar Mac Nessa, and that was our last episode. I'm Aaron Hegarty. I'm joined by the other co-founder and my sister,
Sarah Hegarty.
Hey. And this podcast is sponsored by Patreon support, so thanks for all our Patreon support. You can go to patreon.com/candlelittales if you want to do that. But liking and sharing and subscribing to the channel helps loads too. Happy fucking post-Christmas, everybody. It's over. It's done. We've got the presents. We're very happy. We're Santa's delivered. And also, happy belated solstice. It's after the solstice. We're in the lighter half of the year. It's getting brighter. Technically.
Well, we're not. We're still in the deep midwinter, but we've passed the darkest point.
Yeah.
The point.
It's getting brighter. It's getting brighter.
This would ordinarily be a live stream, but given that there is a storm that keeps blowing in and out, and that we are down the country in Cork, we figured we wouldn't rely on the Wi-Fi for streaming, and we just pre-record it.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
So got the rebels! We're in our family home, which we're very lucky to get back to. And we are, considering staying here forevermore because we can't go anywhere else anymore. But that's not the topic of today's conversation. Today's conversation will be all about the death of Conchubar Mac Nessa. Now, before we do that, we probably have to talk about his birth because he was born on a very auspicious day. But before we talk about his birth, we have another birthday to celebrate.
Yes, that is true. And actually, we want to dedicate this little chat to Anthony Nahual, who arrived yesterday afternoon in Guatemala.
Antonio Noel, or Noel, fault you.
Nahual. Not Noel.
Jaguar Tony is what his name means.
Tony Jaguar, I think you mean.
Yeah. Anyway, that's our nephew. He was born in Guatemala yesterday.
He arrived to the sound of singing and drums, and he was born with a caul over his head, which means he will be able to see into the other world and will never drown. So there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool, didn't know that.
Yeah, I know. I was trying to say it, but you
he's a seer.
kept talking.
That's awesome. So we now have titles, which is very scary. I'm not really sure I agree with titles at the best of times. But I'm an uncle and you're an aunt.
Yeah. We'll deal with that another time. That's fine. That's also fine. But yeah.
Do we have responsibilities now?
No.
Alright, so let's crack into, after this episode being dedicated to our lovely and wonderful new nephew, we can now start talking about the lad in question is Conchubar Mac Nessa, the king of the Ulster cycle, and he was born on that very auspicious day which connected him to Jesus Christ.
Yeah, which I think was kind of probably a bit of a later.
Must have been something that added on. It sounds like something that's stitched in. It sounds like something that's like, oh yeah, he was definitely born the same day as Jesus Christ after they found out who Jesus was and tied it in to kind of give him a bit more gravity.
Yeah, no, it's definitely kind of a later invention or a later insert into that particular cycle of mythology. There were various different things where you get these very obvious little stitchings because a lot of the mythology was written down by Christian era monks because we didn't have a writing system before that, which is why Irish mythology is kind of so fragmented in general. We developed a writing system late. In fact, we didn't develop it. We got one from Rome. That's where our writing system came from.
Oh.
Yeah, but Oom is not there are no books in Oom.
Sure.
Oom was a system for marking graves and writing out short messages, but it's not one of the reasons the Greek and Roman mythology is very, very well preserved is because people wrote it down. Or in Mesoamerica, again, they had a writing system. The indigenous people there, the Mayans, had a very extensive kind of hieroglyphic, pictographic kind of writing system. So a lot of their mythology is, there was a concerted effort to destroy it by the people who arrived later, but it's relatively well preserved and it's relatively coherent. Whereas in Ireland, writing was developed late, or arrived late, and actually people didn't write important things down. They were encoded in stories, and people told stories, and that was how information was passed down. So it was kind of an interesting one because it sort of I'm about to go on a tangent here, but I think it's really interesting in terms of like, we often think of progress as being kind of linear. Like it goes, you get writing and then you stop having to remember things and then you get other stuff and like, but actually it doesn't seem like it was a priority for the Irish to write stuff down. Because why would you write it down when you could just remember it? And actually like it was kind of important to be able to memorize things, like the memorization of the sagas and of for the Brehons, for the
something
lawyers.
to fucking do, I suppose. Like,
Well, like, not only that, but like that was the skill.
Yeah, that was the skill.
That was what made you good at what you were doing, was the ability to recall information.
Added to the prestige and the status of being able to do that and show that off in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so there was something about like writing didn't seem to add anything for a very long time to our ancestors, so they didn't go in for it. But anyway, the upshot of that is that it was written down by Christians. By Christian monks.
And then you have all of those.
And there's all kinds of questions about whether any of it is remotely authentic.
Sure.
Which isn't really knowable in any real degree.
Not really knowable, but it's interesting to look at like Conchubar Mac Nessa. So he's supposed to have been born on the 25th of December, the same days as Jesus, and then his death story ties in with Jesus as well. So there's a big effort to tie him into.
There's a big effort to tie him, which is a really interesting one because like he's an interesting one to pick to tie in, and I think it ties in a lot as well with we're quite used these days to associating Christianity and Catholicism with a kind of a misogyny that came through in later years, but like the early Christians in Ireland were the ones who blocked emotion in the 4th century to say that women didn't have souls. So like the Irish Christians were not actually, the early Christians were not in the same way that they later became. But I think it's interesting that Conchubar is linked with Christ when in his personal life he is not very Christ-like.
Yeah.
And I think that also feeds into the way that the Táin is often told to this day, where Maeve is the bad guy and Conchubar is the good guy. Where if you look at the Proof Scale, like that's not the case at all.
Absolutely, the background stories may came out to be a terrible king and making some desperate decisions, and yet, you have this little look at the old. But again, it's kind of like it's picking the side that you want to associate with, not necessarily. Because you want Cuchulainn to be the hero of the story, therefore you want the Crave Rua to be the more downtrodden. The curse that's put on them is kind of sadder, and then as a justification for that empathy, then you need to make the king some way more the good guy opposed, and then villainize the other. And
then you villainize the other, which is interesting because like that's one of the things that I think is the best thing about Irish mythology is that doesn't work.
It doesn't really, no.
And if you look at Maeve as a character, she's every bit as complex as Conchubar is, in that she's not a particularly nice ruler either, but she's also an extremely good ruler. Like she's able to balance the other world with this world and manage Cruachan, which is this kind of hellmouth kind of a place in some ways, really.
Yeah, it is. Everything opens up from the hill of Cruachan.
And like she's able to deal with that. She's able to negotiate with that. She's able to manage that. She takes in exiles. She's a great queen in her own right, and like obviously the Táin is not a good. But like I think that's one of the interesting things as well, is that like the Táin is not, in the attitude of the time, it is not considered to be a good war. Because so many people die in it.
Well, we'll talk plenty about Queen Maeve.
We'll talk about her next week.
Next week, because there's loads to talk about that. But in terms of just focusing in on this character, which is, again, he's been stitched in with being born on the same day as Christ, and then having this weird ending to his death story, where he hears about the saviour of men, the king of the world, has been born and is now being crucified unjustly, and no one will fight for him. He hairs off to it. And in defence of him, or in an attempt to rescue him, dies and is called the first pagan to go to heaven according to the Christians that wrote it.
Yeah,
mental.
Which I think is kind of funny because he died thinking of Jesus, and his blood functioned as holy water, which is a little bit.
Well, the way there was waves. It's a
little creepy.
It's a weird. But the good guy connection, the idea that he's like, I mean, absolves all of his sins is the big thing in Christianity. It's like, okay, he's done all this stuff, but he did at the right point at his death. He was only thinking about God, and therefore everything is washed away, and therefore he's a good guy. He died a good guy.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. Everything is redeemable.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting as well to look at Crohor as a person and as a king, because, like, it was really interesting when we, you know, over the years of us telling the Táin and the Ulster cycle, we've looked more and more at the Príomh Scéalta, at Crohor, at, you know, what he does in his behaviour during the Curse of Macha story, his behaviour in the Sons of Ishnach story, you know, his pride, his treatment of women, his anger, his rape of Maeve, you know, he sentences a poet to death for sleeping with one of his wives, which is completely taboo.
Even though he was said to be the protector of all poets and having protected 50 poets at one stage, on his good side, and the good stories of him is
which is actually a really interesting note, because Conchubar Mac Nessa was also the protector of the poets.
Yeah.
And so he is remembered and he is recorded as being an extremely good king. And who did the remembering and the recording?
The fucking poets, lads.
So, like,
I mean, he definitely buttered up the right guys.
It's a kind of a funny thing, because it was a time when, you know, the poets were considered, or supposedly during this period, the poets were considered generally in Ireland to be getting too much power. There were too many of them, and they were getting too powerful. Because of course you remember the power of the satire.
Yes.
Which was like, if a poet wrote a satire about a king, the king could lose his position. And it was a real kind of, like, it was a serious threat. Like, we think of satire as you know, poking fun at the powerful now, but it's kind of toothless. But there were very definite rules to satire in Ireland. Like, you couldn't make fun of someone's physical appearance, was one thing.
Oh wow.
You had, like, there were certain things that were, like, off limits. But you could eviscerate someone in verse for the things they said and the things they did. And, like, the first satire goes into this is in the story of Brest, which I don't think we've told on the podcast yet, but it's a satire against a king who is mean.
Yeah.
And actually, that, I think, leads us into the king and the role of the king.
Well, yeah, because again, in terms of the good guy aspect, whether he's a good guy or not, and whether or not he's favourable amongst the poets or not, the role that he actually had to do was to be a king. And he made some desperate mistakes along the way, but he was also pretty good at a few things.
Well, this is the thing. Like, if you think about it, I think it's an interesting one to try and get our heads around, because we might, you know, we have a kind of an image of a king, which I think is very, you know, based on kind of fantasy, really more than history.
Legend and kind of that idea.
Yeah,
of
a little bit King Arthur, but really we don't really see King Arthur doing very much either, do we? In films, other than having a love triangle with his wife who doesn't fancy him anymore. You know, like, that's the actual administrative side of being a king is not really looked at. Whereas in medieval Ireland, or in the mythic period of Ireland, the role of the king was very tied up with this hospitality idea. So it was really, really important to be generous.
Right.
And to be hospitable, and like, actually, if we were to give it a modern job, it would be less CEO and more events manager.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it's the brother of the drinks company who gets to, like, bring the lads out for the, you know, it's the hosting, it's the bringing them to the
hosting
thing. Yeah.
And the other major important thing about being a king was the settling of disputes. And you do see that in the stories of Conchubar Mac Nessa. There's the story of the intoxication of the Ulstermen. There's various different stories. The story of the Champion's Portion, which we'll be telling in January on the podcast. And because Conchubar is managing the Crave Rua. So he's managing
the job.
Like, you're in a warrior culture. There's no, like, the culture at that time, it's not just a warrior culture, it's a culture of champions.
Yeah.
There's, you know, we like to say these days there's no I in team, but that was a team of I's.
Yeah.
That was a team of people who were not on the same page because they were all looking to get the biggest amount of glory themselves. Because that was how the Celts did warfare. They didn't have the kind of Roman, like that was, there's a lot written about that with the Romans versus the Celts, where like the Celts would come in fucking naked and screaming, and the Romans will line up with their shield wall and cut them to pieces, because it was a totally different mentality about warfare. So Conchubar is in charge of a large number of egotistical, competitive, violent men whose like business is violence.
Yeah, Jesus.
And the fact that he actually, like, I think that's why he's remembered as a great king, is because he keeps them from killing each other.
Pretty much. And he's able to like negotiate between everything. Like even at the start of the whole story, there's a bragging match going on outside, and he goes, "Here, lads, let's have come on, let's have a drink and let's have a feast. Let's come on, bring it inside now, and let's just like
let's calm it down, have a drink, tell some stories." And to be honest, like that in my mind is what Conchubar does.
Yeah.
There's one story that mentions the 3 parts of the King's Day, and I can't remember which story it is now, but it's that he spends the morning playing fiddle with Fergus McRoy.
That's right.
And he spends the afternoon overseeing the training of the boys' troop. And he spends the evening in the feasting hall.
I think it's in the naming of how we call his name. I think
it could be in one of the early. I don't know if it's any podcast we told, but I like that's his job.
Yeah.
He's keeping his head sharp on strategy.
Yeah.
Which is what fiddle was. It was a strategic training game, which is what chess was as well. It was a war game. He's overseeing, and this was another innovation of Conchubar Mac Nessa's, was the boys' troop, to bring together the next generation of warriors, to train them, and not leave it all up to the individuals, but actually bring the tribe together. So he's overseeing the training of the young men, and then in the evening, he's in the feasting hall. And like, that sounds to modern ears like then he goes and gets pissed.
But
and
there's
gets
an awful
wasted,
lot, but
that's not what he's doing.
And as anyone in hospitality or events will know, how much business is done in those areas, you know. All of it, yeah. The back scratching, the whole, and like disputes to landowners, the welcoming of whether it's poets or filids or other kings or the kingdom or other areas.
You get a lot as well of like, you get a lot of mentions of merchants from abroad. You get a lot of mentions of trade. You get a lot of mentions of like people coming from the Far East. You get a lot of dignitaries coming through that are being wined and dined and hosted, and that's also a huge part of his role, is making sure those people go away happy.
Yeah.
Like one of the jobs of Conal Carnock guarding the border, which I always think is hilarious, is that he met. He would meet the poets as they were leaving and ask them if they'd had a good time in Ulster. And if they said no, he would give them gold until they said yes.
I love that.
Like he would just make sure that they were happy leaving. So it's that whole thing of like making sure people are happy leaving. That's a huge part of his role.
And making sure, like, in fairness to him, whatever about the other desperate mistakes that he made when along his way of his life, which led to kind of the downfall of Crave Rule.
Yeah.
He also had like a brutally difficult task with these astronomically big mythic characters of Cuchulainn and Conal Carnock, these maybe not Larry, but the other big warriors and the Sons of Ishmael being huge warriors,
big personalities,
big
characters and brilliant warriors, and
all stars that needed special attention, you know. And he managed to keep the simmering between them down so that they could actually fly under the one banner, which seemed like a massive. That was basically his role.
His role, yeah.
That seems to be the reason why he's gone down in history, or mythology rather, or whatever crossover we want to see between, as a memorable king, you know.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that he's a good king. I don't think that he's a good person. A little bit like Curoy McDara a few weeks ago. He's somebody who may have had a lot of good things to do with men, but did not include women in that.
But like
his behaviour towards women is quite appalling, which is really interesting when you think about like he's the son of Nessa. He's Conchubar Mac Nessa.
Yeah.
So his father is not part of his name.
No.
And she was a warrior, and she's the one. He was unusual in that he was not the son of a king. He was she married Fergus MacRoy, and her bride price from Fergus MacRoy was that he give up being a king for a year so that her son could be king for a year, and so that his children could then be called sons of kings and could have like a shot at the role.
And
then he took over.
What really interestingly, what always jumps out at me in that snippet of information is that Nessa managed to steal a lot of the wealth away from all the wealthy people in Ulster, and then give it to Conchubar to give back to them, to show the sign of generosity and abundance that he had. And so suddenly then they're like, all right, we want him as king, because he's so generous, and he kept that up. And one of the things that was said about him was that he was very good at judging a situation and choosing,
which was one of the major kingly virtues, was being like an arbiter.
Yeah.
And someone who could actually make a judgment. That was a huge part of the role as well.
And yet, as you say, like in this death story, he's just like it's comical how stupid he looks, because he's brought off and his vanity is exploited. He's brought off to show off his legs and his calves to the women of Connacht who are fawning at him, and he can only love to do it, so he's just running over.
Which is really interesting, like, because he has this thing with women where he's very good looking, and he's acclaimed as being very good looking by the women of Ulster. They're the ones who make it illegal for him to wear a long tunic so that they can admire his calves all year round.
I mean, he must have had very good calves.
I mean, I don't know how good your calves need to be for them to have to be out all year round, but apparently he had those.
The women demanded it. So
yeah, that's what the women were after. So, like,
or maybe he claimed that.
He's very attractive to women, and but he's also jealous and extremely possessive and extremely prideful, and he's got all of he's got these kind of
this goes down slightly into that like weird realm of what's attractive is not always necessarily good either. What's attractive is not always positive. What's attractive can be sexy but very sinister, or there's a real weird line with that of where attraction is wrong.
The dark triad thing. People are more people with certain personality traits that are often more narcissistic or more sociopathic, or often at first glance seem more attractive.
Scary, but again, it like if once
we still have them.
Once you peel it back, once you look back and look at the layers in this story, this character, you feel very, very, very.
He's very his stuff with women is very toxic. Because he's got like.
For fuck's sake, he beheads the sons of Ishnak, like for stealing his so-called soon-to-be wife that is just always weird and can
that's
be
so weird
read in a creepy way with the Deirdre.
Yeah, it was quite funny. We did a schools workshop just last week before the schools all closed. On the Táin, we had one group of first years. We told them the Táin from the point of view of Connacht, if you like. So with Maeve as the hero, and another group got Conchubar as the hero. But it's really interesting sitting in with a group of kids who are, when they ask how old the boys' troop are, you're like, well, they're right your age actually, and talking about the Deirdre story, he was maybe about you guys' age when she was born. And she was maybe a couple of years older than you guys, and he was twice that age, so would you want to go away with someone? And they were all kind of like, ugh. No.
Like horrendous. Again, I guess different time, you kind of go, it was a different time. It's still weird, like it's just still.
I mean, that's as if we don't have child brides today. We absolutely do.
Exactly.
There are children being married off to people who are much older than, and it's never been good. And I think that's a really interesting thing in the Deirdre story is that I have never read a version that claim that Crahor was in the right there.
Nah, but you literally can't paint it right because this like.
I mean, you can. There are stories that are told where as we spoke of before, where Maeve is absolutely the bad guy in the song.
Sure, but
we just leave out the Crahor raped her bit entirely.
Oh yeah, completely. And you leave out the really fucking creepy pedo aspect of him, nurturing a bride.
Yeah, raising a bride.
Like wrong. But always, and no matter what telling you go with, because with the details, even if you gloss them up to be great, his downfall is his vanity and his pride in every one of those stories.
In every one of those stories.
The Curse of Macha, where he basically brings about the destruction of the Crave Rue with the goddess's curse.
Mm-hmm.
He's so vain that he can't imagine anything is better than his horses and anyone going against his word.
Yeah, and he's publicly called out against it, and it's because of the public nature of the insult that he just won't let it go.
And so you again and again and again you have his pride, his ego, his vanity being his greatest downfall. And in Deirdre, exact same thing happens, and he can't let go of it. And essentially in his death story, exact same thing.
It's the same thing, yeah. Well, like it's, and I think the 7 years is probably worth dwelling on a little bit, because as a sort of a penance for somebody who's a great king, who has serious issues around women and serious issues around pride. He's lured away by vanity, and gets this brain ball stuck in the top of his skull.
Can we discuss the brain balls for one moment before we move on?
Sure.
What the fuck? I mean, seriously, brain balls, trophies. This was the weirdest part of the whole thing. They get brains, they put them in the line. Is that actually a thing?
That was how they used to make their slingshot ammo. Now, I don't think you use human brain all the time. I think they probably used animal brain a lot of the time, but that is, you can, something to do with the chemical reaction between lime and a brain. You can get these, they will shrink down and become incredibly harder than stone.
No way.
So that was what they used to use as ammunition.
Holy shit.
And the soul was believed to reside in the head. So that was one of the reasons as well to do it to an enemy. That was why they took the heads of their enemies. But that was a way of keeping trophies, was that you would basically create a weapon out of the brain, which is a little like, I would imagine there's an aspect to that of kind of psychological warfare as well, of like,
massively,
this is how we hit somebody with the brain.
But I love that the fact that there was a king who was killed. There was a prophecy that he would get his revenge after death, and his brain was kept.
They kept it on a little shelf just to make sure.
Yeah. Don't keep it like clearly.
Clearly, you should have just cremated this guy.
Yeah.
But the 7 years, of Crahor's kind of half-life.
Once he gets the brain really stuck in his head and he's fucking out of it.
And like stitched in with gold thread to match his hair so that it doesn't look disfiguring, which is important. But then he has 7 years where he's not allowed to raise his voice.
No crack, no.
And he's not allowed to get drunk, and he's not allowed to have sex, and he's not allowed to ride a horse, and he's basically not allowed to get overexcited. He's not allowed to raise his own blood pressure. In any way for any reason. So he does pretty well to last 7 years. Like that's a lot of self-control.
Yeah.
But I think it's also kind of interesting as a sort of I think one of the reasons that it's interesting is that it is another kind of like, I guess, point in his favor as a good king, because he is able to hold onto himself. He is self-controlled enough that he's able to live with this, where I think a lot of people wouldn't be.
Yeah. And that for me, that just screams sociopathic king, like, oh, I will not raise my voice or get angry anymore.
I don't know. I don't think sociopaths have a lot of self-control. I think that's one of the one of the things. That's why a lot of them are in jail.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think the kind of corporate sociopath type.
I was just thinking of Dexter, that
yes,
kind of like
the trope of the very, very self-controlled serial killer.
Yeah.
Who doesn't have any emotions. Well, yeah, like it's that, and it's also just the kind of the level of self-control that he has, and I think it's also, you know, it's interesting and a little bit ironic in a dramatic sense that he's not allowed to go near a woman for the last 7 years of his life.
Yeah.
You know, for somebody who's caused such grief and devastation with his attempts to control and coerce women.
Yeah. It's an unbelievable. It's a very
to just have
penance.
that taken off him.
Yeah.
Like, you're not allowed. And I don't think I don't know. I think the timelines are always a little bit fuzzy. But the death of Léirí Buadach, which is the story connected to that poet that Crahor sentences to death for sleeping with his wife.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that happens in the last 7 years of his life, but it could do.
Yeah, would make sense.
It would make sense.
That he's allowed jealousy and anger, but isn't able to express it.
Yeah, well, like that he's still trying to control the women in his life, even though he's
God.
he can't have anything to do with them.
Fuck that.
It wouldn't seem out of character to me for Crahor to be like that. Do you know?
No. I mean, it's a weird penance at the end of his life, and it's almost like makes sense that he became the Christian dude, or like he became the one that went to heaven according to the Christians.
Because he has these 7 years of living like a monk.
Yeah, it's like, he's repenting, and that's kind of like what you're supposed to do. That sounds like the good penance. You don't get, you literally, that's there, here's the ingredients to be a monk.
Yeah.
You know, and don't fly off the handles, and don't get angry, don't warfare, and no battling, no
And I
elation
mean,
and joy
one
and
has
desire.
to wonder what he was, you know, I mean, I'd imagine he was still doing the same thing he'd always done in terms of being at the feasting hall and letting everybody else get drunk while he didn't.
Yeah.
Which was probably just a slight exaggeration of what he had been doing anyway up until that point.
The cunning fella. I mean, I love the fact that he suddenly hears about this character, and it turns out to be Jesus Christ, and he was running off to save him. It's, when I heard it, I thought it couldn't be true. Like, this whole thing was made up.
I mean, true.
I mean, but like, to be associated to it, I was like, what? I mean, yeah. Again, the more you look into these things, you're like, bro, that's really heavily recorded and stamped down. I thought there might be another version of his death. I couldn't find one.
I have never seen one, but I've never seen a version of his birth that isn't connected to the 25th of December either.
Of course. And I guess he married, you know, he had married Queen Maeve. That ended up in rape. That ended up in a whole massive breakup thing that led to the feud that was already involved.
Yes.
We'll get on to Maeve next week.
We will. We'll talk about Maeve next week.
Which I'm looking forward to.
She has a very nice retirement.
She does.
For a while.
And that's us for now. Listen, we also have a very special show, the McDonald's Pig, which we recorded in the Lexicon in Dunleary, and it'll be up on the tobeirish.ie website very soon, and that's up on our YouTube channel. It's definitely up in the Lexicon. Anyway, it's going live. It was recorded by Simon O'Neill, and that was very helpful. We cut it together, and it's beautiful. It looks great, and that was fun, and that's what we released on Christmas Day. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. It's a beautiful video, and we enjoy telling it because it's full of the crack that's on Christmas Day. Not so much for this year, because this year's been weird. Fuck that. But that's what we've had in the store. We'll have more Death series coming for the rest of this month.
Well, we've Maeve left, and then Cuchulainn.
Great.
So we've two more.
And then we're into, I think so too. And then we're into January, and we'll have another epic tale for you then.
One of those will be in January anyway.
Yeah.
So we'll be moving on to another tale of another.
The champions
section.
portion type stuff.
Yes, the champions portion.
Thanks for listening as always. Thanks for our patrons for buying us new equipment, which sounds great. Don't hit the equipment.
Don't punch the equipment here.
That's what we do with the support that we get from Patreon. We reinvest it. We buy Oisin software and computers and mics, and that's what we do and have been doing. And it's just getting better and better, this podcast quality wise. I hope the sound quality wise. I hope we're matching as we improve it. Anyway, thank you very much. Patreon.com/candlelittales if you haven't done already. Also liking and sharing and telling your friends about it is always a help. This is usually edited and mastered by Oisin Ryan. Rory O'Shea's on the team of editing as well. Thanks to, again, the ability to buy the software and help out.
Yeah.
Is there anything else I forgot, Soraka?
I don't think so. Nully Conna, and we'll see you again in 2021.
And if you haven't already seen, we're doing a storytelling course on the 9th of January, FYI. If you want to learn how to tell stories, learn a bit more about Irish mythology, have a bit of semantics thrown at you, have a bit of like analysis of story.
Do you mean semiotics when you say semantics?
Semantics. That's semantics. Alright guys, thanks very much and chat to you soon.